This is a video tutorial for working with stretch DEM, symbolize DEM, and we're just going to review the steps for that. So we're going to just take a look at our working directory. There's 5 steps here. We need to understand symbology for DEM, understand different color ramps that are typical in digital elevation, also talk about the type that we can apply to a stretched color ramp. We're going to talk about applying transparency and then also tailoring a streamline legend to high-low notation. So to get started here, we're going to be working in a MXD. I've called it stretch DEM, and you can see I have a hillshade overlaid by the original DEM roster. And I'm not exporting any rosters outside of ArcGIS. I'm just going to symbolize. So in this case, what we're interested in doing is we're interested in producing a value added to the current DEM. So we can look at the current DEM. We see a nice grayscale that goes from low values of 277 to high values of 2957. Okay, so these are just digital elevation values. These are looking at the very high and the very low. So what I can do is I can go into properties now, and if I want to symbolize this, I have a couple choices. I can do vector field, unique values, classified or stretched. And usually we're using classified or stretched. So let's just do classified first. So if we click on classified, and we see our values here, we can go into classification, and we're going to just use natural breaks, 5 classes, just like we would do for, say, a chloropleth map based on polygons. And so each polygon holds a value, and we just want to class those values. Same difference here. We have all the different classification methods available. So natural breaks 5 classes is what it's going to default to. Let's go ahead and use that. Then what we can do is pick the color ramp. So maybe in this case I want to go from a minty green into a forest green. And I say apply, OK. And so what that does is it classes out from my low value up to my high value. Okay, that's all good and fine. So sometimes we want to show the distinct class breaks. Sometimes we don't. So if we go into properties and use stretched, what stretched is going to do, it's going to get rid of the specific breaks in the interior of the color ramp and just give us a high and a low. So in this case, we can see our high and our low values. We can also invert this. So if you want, instead of whites to be representing high values, you could invert, and you can see it flips the color ramp. Grayscale is pretty boring. So what we can do is we can go into some of the color ramps that are typical of digital elevation. One of them goes from dark brown to a kind of bluish color. So it's this one. Say apply. That gives us that color ramp. Another one is, this is very typical, where you get lots of different color variations on the inside, and you go from sort of a light blue and yellow representing low elevation into whites representing high elevation. You can apply that. That's very typical, very nice. There's another one that is a little bit of a lighter touch. It's this one. It's the same basic color ramp though. I personally like to use this one. And now I need to take a look at the type of stretch. So I've been using standard deviations. There's also percent clip. And what this is doing is that it's looking at all the cell values and then applying a method to organize those cell values along the color ramp. So each one of these is going to result in a slightly different appearance. Percent clips, very standard. Oftentimes I use that and say apply. And what this does now, it gives us a high value and a low value, and just gives us no class breaks in the inside. It just gives us a relative scale of color to understand the values. So what we can do now is we can go into properties once we have that organized and go to display, and here's where we can apply transparency. So between, say, 50% and 70%, or maybe 40% and 70% is pretty typical for this process. On a hillshade overlay, I'm just going to use 50%. So I go apply 50%. And we can see that there's a nice hillshade that's available to the DEM. It really brings the whole DEM to life, and it operates as an excellent base map for laying on top vector features, say roads, rivers, or some type of GIS analysis that we're going to do. It gives us a nice context if we're really interested in showing elevation and elevation change relative to the subject matter, the theme of our final map. So I'm just going to go ahead and say OK at 50%. Well, actually, let's just try 70% and see what that gives us. So even at 70%, we still get a real value added by putting in some color on top of the hillshade. So I'm going to go back to 50% here and say apply OK. And one thing we do need to do is we need to organize our legends. So the legend is going to be really critical to have when we're showing this differentiation in color. So let's go into Layout View. And in Layout View, I'm not going to spend a lot of time laying out the whole map sheet. This is 8.5 by 11 portrait. It's probably not what I would use for this particular scene, seeing as how it's so horizontal in nature. But all I want to concentrate on right now is just producing the legend. So I'm just going to go to, I'm in Layout View, so I have my layout tools here. And I can kind of move this around. I can zoom into it if I want to. So if I wanted to bring it up a little bit closer, I could bring it closer. I'm just going to have it be at 100%. And let's go ahead and produce a legend here. So I'm going to say Insert Legend. And I want to not have hillshade show up in the legend because hillshade's kind of, there's nothing particular of value in the values of hillshade. Okay, it's just a hillshade base layer. That's all we care about. But I do want the DEM values. So I say next, and I'm not going to have any framing. And I say finish, and it gives me this basic output. Now, there's a few things wrong with the basic output. One, it just says legend. We could use legend, or we could be a little bit more specific as to what it is we're trying to represent. The titling is not particularly meaningful, so output underscore srtm.tiff for a public audience is not valuable. And the value, we don't really know what the value is. We know it's meters, but the public doesn't, so we need to fine-tune this legend a little bit. And we could, if we wanted to, we could get rid of the values or we could keep them in. And if you want to get rid of the actual value, you can just simply click on your table of contents and click on the high and the low, and then that becomes active and you can change it there. Same thing with value. Let's do this. For value, let's change that to meters. I'm going to keep the actual value, so 2957 and 277. I'll keep that. I'll keep a high and a low. And you can see it gives us kind of these little break marks. So our low, then there's a middle value which it doesn't state, and a high value. Let's go back and change the titling here. I'm going to get rid of the actual name of the layer so it doesn't show up in the legend. And then I'm going to change the titling of the legend to be terrain elevation. So here, instead of it being legend, I'll just call it terrain elevation. That's just a little bit more meaningful way to express the theme of the map. So something like that works out pretty well. So all we're doing here is that we're creating a stretched version of DEM values as opposed to a classed legend that we've already worked with vector features with choropleth mapping, where classing becomes really important in that scenario. Here we're just going from a low to a high because all we care about in this particular situation is that we're showing the elevation change. That's the base map product that we're interested in. We might change the theme of this whole map as we add in more features, but right now it's just basically a terrain elevation map, and it's showing that terrain by the hillshade, and then also showing the highs and the lows in DEM based on this color ramp that we've put together.